Sakamaki is the only candidate who satisfies every element of the primary hook spec simultaneously. He is a single-named individual, not a statistic. His story physically enacts the episode's entire thesis in miniature. The attempted suicide is the Senjin-kun in action. The failed bomb is the doctrine failing, and waking on the beach expecting execution is the exact psychological fracture Act 4 will exploit. The open question, what did the prisoners say, stays genuinely unanswered, since Sakamaki's cold open reveals the existence of a pattern without revealing its content. The secrecy beat attaches naturally to the classified apparatus, Camp Tracy, ATIS files, rather than being asserted. And critically, choosing Sakamaki preserves the episode's strongest material, Wada's bomber flight, Kubo's cave, the Kaura breakout, for Act 4 payoffs, and the Act 5 counterweight where the retention system needs them. His status as prisoner number 1 also gives the ring close a literal homecoming. The pattern that changed the Pacific War begins and ends with the first man Japan declared dead. On the morning of December 8, 1941, hours after the smoke rose over Pearl Harbor, a young Japanese naval officer set a time-delayed bomb inside his own submarine and waited to die. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki's midget submarine had failed. The mission was over. And by the code he had been trained under as an officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy, only one acceptable ending remained. He armed the scuttling charge, expecting the blast to erase the crippled vessel, and in every way that mattered to him, to erase the disgrace of failure along with it. The bomb never went off. Exhausted, Sakamaki lost consciousness in the water, and the Pacific carried him where his training insisted no Japanese soldier could ever go. Ashore, alive, into enemy hands. He woke on a Hawaiian beach, staring up the barrel of an American rifle, fully expecting to be executed where he lay. He was not. Instead, the Americans took him into custody and gave him a designation no one in Japan's military had prepared for, because no one in Japan's military believed it would ever be needed. Kazuo Sakamaki became prisoner of war number 1. Over the next 4 years, tens of thousands of Japanese servicemen would follow Sakamaki into Allied captivity, and in interrogation rooms from Australia to a secretly wired luxury hotel in the California hills, American intelligence officers began to notice something strange. Prisoner after prisoner, the same pattern kept surfacing, a pattern Japan's own military doctrine had created without ever intending to. What those prisoners said stayed buried in classified files for decades. It helped change the course of the Pacific War, and it began with the man on that beach, a man who, by the standards of his own country, was already dead. To understand what happened in those rooms, you have to start with a document issued 11 months before Pearl Harbor. On January 8, 1941, Japan's War Department formally promulgated the Senjin-kun, the Field Service Code. On its surface, it was a manual of military ethics, codifying a culture of absolute obedience. It instructed soldiers to joyfully brave death, and it contained one line that would shape the human reality of the entire Pacific War. If alive, do not suffer the disgrace of becoming a prisoner. Under the Senjin-kun, capture was not a misfortune of war. It was a betrayal of the emperor, a disgrace understood to be worse than death itself. A soldier taken alive was permanently severed from Japanese society, his name carrying indelible shame to his family. In the most literal sense his culture allowed, he ceased to exist. The doctrine conditioned encircled soldiers toward suicidal banzai charges or self-inflicted death, rather than surrender. And across the Pacific that is overwhelmingly what they chose. Through nearly 4 years of island warfare, the Western Allies captured somewhere between 35 and 50,000 Japanese prisoners in total. That extraordinarily low figure is a measurement of exactly how deep the no-surrender doctrine ran. But the Senjin-kun had a second effect, one that remained invisible until the first prisoners began to talk. Because the code declared that no honorable soldier would ever be captured, the Japanese military drew a perfectly logical conclusion from its own premise. There was no reason to prepare anyone for captivity. Where Western armies drilled their men on conduct in enemy hands, the familiar mandate of name, rank, and serial number built on the assumption that capture was a normal hazard of war, Japan built no equivalent. No resistance training, no evasion protocol, no counter-interrogation doctrine of any kind. Japan taught its soldiers how to die. It never taught them what to do if they lived. And some of them lived, almost never by choice. The men who ended up in Allied hands were frequently unconscious when it happened, pulled half-drowned from the ocean, carried out of the jungle severely wounded or delirious with disease, cut off from any command that could order them to die. They woke up inside a situation their training had declared impossible. Historians describe what followed as a profound psychological dislocation, a social death. In the eyes of the nation and the family, the captured man no longer existed. His former loyalties and military obligations, many prisoners came to feel, had been permanently voided along with him. What they expected next was agony. Interrogation surveys found that 84% of Japanese prisoners anticipated being tortured or executed immediately upon capture. What they received instead was processing under the Geneva Conventions. Medical stabilization, decent rations, humane treatment from sophisticated, even empathetic interrogators. And in the gap between what these men expected and what actually happened to them, something began to break open. American intelligence would learn to walk through that opening again and again. But first, the United States had to confront a problem of its own making. It had almost no one who could speak with these prisoners, except for one group of Americans it had just locked behind barbed wire. In November 1941, weeks before the war began, the U.S. Army quietly opened the 4th Army Intelligence School inside an abandoned airplane hangar at the Presidio of San Francisco. Its mission was to train Japanese language military linguists, and it recruited where the language actually lived, among the Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans of the West Coast. Then, on February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. More than 120,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly removed from the West Coast and incarcerated in camps. The Army now faced an absurdity of the government's own construction. Its most strategically vital language program drew its students from communities officially declared too dangerous to remain in their own homes. Because Nisei soldiers could no longer be stationed inside the exclusion zone, the school itself, now the Military Intelligence Service Language School, relocated in spring 1942 to Camp Savage, Minnesota, and later to Fort Snelling. By spring 1946, it had trained roughly 6,000 military linguists for the Pacific. The men who filled those classrooms carried a weight no other American soldiers were asked to bear. Master Sergeant Harry K. Fukuhara enlisted from inside the Gila River internment camp in Arizona. Sergeant Grant Hirabayashi, after graduating from the language school, spent his leave visiting his parents at the Tule Lake Camp in California, arriving in the uniform of the United States Army, passing through barbed wire and beneath guard positions where the machine guns pointed inward toward his own family. His parents, like many Nisei families, urged him to serve honorably anyway. He would go on to interrogate Japan's soldiers while America imprisoned his family. The Navy refused to commission Japanese Americans as officers at all. Its separate Japanese language school at the University of Colorado Boulder trained roughly 100 white officers instead. And to teach them, it recruited over 150 Nisei instructors, many transported directly from incarceration camps. In the field, the danger compounded. Nisei linguists worked at the forward edge of battle, from Guadalcanal to Saipan to Okinawa, and were routinely mistaken for the enemy by their own side. Many required white bodyguards, simply to avoid being shot by American troops during cave flushing and interrogation operations. And for some, the war carried a still darker possibility. Many Nisei, the Kibei, had received part of their education in Japan before the war, and as they interrogated prisoners or prepared for the planned invasion of the home islands, they carried the private terror of knowing they might one day face their own brothers in combat. Around them, the machinery grew enormous. In September 1942, the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, was established in Melbourne under General MacArthur's command, pooling American and Australian linguists. The Japanese military, presuming the Allies could never read its complex language, took few security precautions with written material in the field. Operational orders, code books, and personal diaries traveled into battle unsecured, and ATIS made that assumption catastrophically expensive. Over the course of the war, its linguists translated more than 2 million captured documents and interrogated more than 14,000 prisoners, generating 20 million pages of English language intelligence. It even ran a document restoration subsection, using specialized chemicals and electric irons to make blood-soaked, charred papers legible again. A year later, Admiral Nimitz unified Navy, Army, and Marine intelligence in the Central Pacific under Jikpo-a in Hawaii, leaning on the same Nisei linguists. The apparatus was built, the languages were in place, and when prisoners finally sat down across from these interrogators, men whose own loyalty their government doubted, what they said next would reach further than anyone in Tokyo or Washington imagined. Because the first thing American interrogators discovered was that the fastest way to open a Japanese prisoner was not force. It was something the prisoners found far more disarming. So what actually made them talk? The answer was written down in 1943, on Guadalcanal, by a Marine major who had spent decades in Japan as a missionary. Major Sherwood F. Moran rejected the aggressive, demeaning interrogation tactics of conventional practice entirely. His internal memo, Suggestions for Japanese Interpreters Based on Work in the Field, argued that an interrogator must act with deep human sympathy and speak with a prisoner as one human being to another. In practice, Moran would sit with a terrified captive and open in flawless colloquial Japanese, not with military questions, but with the geography of the man's home village, the rivers, the bridges, the psychological shock of being treated as a person by an enemy he expected to torture him would collapse the prisoner's defenses in tears, and open a floodgate of tactical intelligence. Why did it work so completely? Remember what the Senjin-kun had done to these men before they ever reached the table? Historian Ulrich Strauss observed that prisoners considered themselves reborn under the authority of their captors. By the logic of their own code, the man who surrendered had already died, erased from his nation, severed from his family, beyond the reach of every former obligation. There was no protocol to fall back on because none had ever been written. No name, rank, and serial number script, no rehearsed silence, and into that void stepped a second force, Giri, the Japanese cultural framework of reciprocal obligation. The humane treatment these men received was not, to them, a neutral courtesy. It was a profound debt, and many prisoners felt it could be discharged only one way: total cooperation. Deprived of the torture they expected, they gave exhaustive, unvarnished answers: military strength, morale, unit locations, immediate tactical deployments, future strategy. The men Japan declared dead became America's most candid witnesses. But could a prisoner's words actually change a battle? Saipan, in July 1944, answered that question twice in 3 weeks, once as tragedy, once as something close to a miracle. In early July, inside an intelligence tent, a language team under 2nd Lieutenant Benjamin Hazard noticed that multiple captured soldiers were repeating one chilling term to describe an impending attack. Gyokusai. Smash the jewel. The prisoners were describing a massive organized suicide attack planned for July 7th. Hazard frantically warned his commanders that this was no standard battlefield maneuver. It was a massive organized suicide attack, and the prisoners were naming the date. Lacking the cultural fluency to grasp the word's weight, the commanders dismissed the translation. Hours later, 4,000 Japanese troops launched the largest and most devastating banzai charge of the entire war. The prisoners had told the truth, freely and precisely. No one had listened. 16 days later, on the same island, someone listened, this time to the prisoner's psychology itself. On July 23rd, during the final mop-up operations on Saipan, Nisei Sergeant Bob Hoichi Kubo slid 100 feet down a rope into a dark, fortified cave where 8 heavily armed Japanese soldiers were holding 122 civilians hostage. Wearing his U.S. Army uniform, carrying only a concealed pistol and his rations, Kubo did what no manual suggested. He removed the pistol, he sat down on the cave floor, he shared his American K rations with the starving enemy, and for 2 tense hours, speaking in their own language, he appealed to their honor, first convincing them he was no spy, then convincing them to live. All 8 surrendered peacefully. 122 civilians walked out of that cave alive. Kubo was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. And what of the prisoners who never spoke to an interrogator at all? For the highest value captives, the United States built something stranger than any interrogation room. Every Japanese prisoner bound for the American mainland passed first through Angel Island in San Francisco Bay, the former immigration station repurposed after Pearl Harbor, where arrivals were searched, fingerprinted, medically examined, and held in heavily guarded barracks. From there, most were dispersed to permanent camps, but selected high-value officers were driven in a bus with blacked-out windows into the California hills to a classified facility codenamed Camp Tracy, P.O. Box 651, Byron Hot Springs. It was the Pacific twin of Fort Hunt in Virginia, P.O. Box 1142, where Jewish refugees interrogated high-value Nazi prisoners. But Camp Tracy was no dungeon. It was a Moorish-style luxury resort. A captured naval officer expecting a brutal cell was instead ushered into a hotel where he soaked in natural hot springs, ate fine meals prepared by Nisei chefs, and chatted freely with fellow officers about the war, never suspecting that every bedroom, hallway, and patio tree around him had been wired with hidden microphones. By simply recording and translating those relaxed, unguarded conversations, U.S. intelligence gathered data on Japanese ship movements, ammunition locations, and biological weapons programs, without coercing a single man. The prisoners at Byron Hot Springs were never asked to betray Japan. They were only asked to relax. The psychological disarmament was intentional, and it was devastatingly effective. Which leaves the final question: how far could this psychological rebirth actually go? Could a prisoner cross all the way over? The answer came on August 9, 1945, in the sky over the dense jungles of Mindanao in the Philippines. In the waist gunner position of a U.S. Marine B-25 bomber sat a captured Japanese Army officer, Second Lieutenant Minoru Wada. He was not there under duress. He had volunteered, hoping, by one act of ultimate betrayal, to end the campaign's bloodshed. Wada personally guided the American pilots to a target no reconnaissance flight had found, the hidden jungle headquarters of his own former unit, the 100th Division, and he watched the bombs fall on his former comrades. The doctrine that promised no Japanese soldier would ever surrender had produced, by war's end, a Japanese officer directing American airstrikes from inside an American bomber. But this raises a harder question. If captivity could remake men this completely, if the pattern really ran this deep, then what do we make of the prisoners who chose the wire instead? Because not every prisoner was reborn, and the ones who refused deserve their place in this story. The title's "every" is where the myth ends and the history begins. At Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, the largest permanent Japanese POW camp in the continental United States, holding 2,162 prisoners at its peak, conditions followed the Geneva Conventions to the letter. Separate quarters for officers, meals of steamed rice with soy sauce, chopsticks supplied through the International Red Cross. Yet camp administrators, understanding what the Senjin-kun did to men in captivity, routinely searched prisoners to deny them ropes and sharp objects. And the prisoners of Camp McCoy mounted 14 separate escape attempts. Everyone failed. They kept trying. Then there was Cowra. At 2 a.m. on August 5, 1944, in a camp in New South Wales, Australia, a downed Zero pilot raised a smuggled bugle. His name was Hajime Toyoshima, the first Japanese prisoner taken in Australia, captured by a Tiwi Islander after crash landing during the Darwin raid. He had given his captors a false name, Tadao Minami, so that his family would never learn he had survived. At the bugle's sound, more than 100 Japanese prisoners charged the wire with sharpened kitchen knives, wearing baseball mitts to grip the barbs, hurling themselves into machine gun fire. It was the largest POW escape attempt of the Second World War, and it was, in essence, a mass suicide, a final bid to reclaim the honor the Senjin-kun said they had lost. 234 Japanese prisoners died. Toyoshima was shot in the chest and died on the wire. The record demands a second correction, too. The war's single greatest intelligence prize in the Pacific did not come from any prisoner. On March 31, 1944, the aircraft carrying Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome crashed into the sea near Cebu during a storm. Filipino guerrillas pulled a wooden box from the wreckage, and inside, bound in a red leather portfolio, lay the Z-Plan, Japan's decisive naval defense strategy for the Marianas. Rushed by submarine to Australia, it was translated under intense pressure by ATIS Nisei linguists George Yamashiro and Yoshikazu Yamada, and their translation allowed Admiral Nimitz to anticipate Japanese diversionary tactics and decisively win the Battle of the Philippine Sea. A captured document, not a broken man. The prisoner supplied the war's tactical bloodstream. The papers Japan never thought to secure supplied its strategic coups. Keep the scale in view as well. Against the roughly 600,000 Japanese soldiers the Soviets captured in Manchuria in the war's final days, men sent into brutal forced labor in Siberia, the Western Allies took perhaps 35,000 to 50,000 prisoners in 4 years of combat. Just 5,324 of them ever reached the continental United States, against some 371,000 to 378,000 Germans. A handful even ended up planting and harvesting on Iowa farms out of Camp Clarinda, easing wartime labor shortages beside wary Midwestern neighbors, though military administrators, wrestling with homefront racism and their own fears about what the Senjin-kun's shame might make these men do, never deployed them widely. The cooperative Japanese prisoner was real. He was also one of the rarest figures of the entire war, and that is the pattern's true meaning. As Strauss's framing suggests, the Senjin-kun erased its soldiers so completely that survival itself felt like a second life belonging to someone else, a doctrine whose human cost was paid in banzai charges, in cave suicides, in the dead on Cowra's wire, and in the strange, unburdened candor of the men who lived. The interrogators paid too. When Harry Fukuhara finally returned to his family's home in Hiroshima during the occupation, he found his mother suffering from radiation exposure, and his older brother dying of acute radiation sickness from the atomic bomb, which brings us back to a beach on Oahu and the man lying on it. Kazuo Sakamaki was carried into a captivity his own country refused to imagine, held first in Hawaii, then at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, and at Kennedy, Texas, one of only a few thousand Japanese prisoners ever to see the American mainland. On December 8, 1941, he had tried to die twice before the war was a day old, once by the scuttling charge that failed, and once by the execution he was certain awaited him on the sand. Neither death came. And everything this story has traced, Moran's sympathy in the Guadalcanal jungle, Kubo's shared rations in the cave, the microphones hidden in the trees of a luxury hotel, Wada's hand-guiding bombers to his own headquarters, and the 1,000 men who chose the wire at Cowra, flows from the collision that began on that beach, between a code that could not imagine a living prisoner, and a war that kept producing them anyway. The Senjin-kun promised its soldiers that capture was the end of existence. For Sakamaki, and for the tens of thousands who followed him, it turned out to be something no doctrine had a word for, a life after the life their country had written off. Prisoner of war, number 1 was, in the eyes of his own nation, the first man of the Pacific War to die and keep breathing. What he and the men after him said in that strange second life helped shorten the war their first lives had been spent to fight. If these classified human margins of the Second World War are worth your time, consider subscribing. There are more of these stories still coming out of the archives.